good morning. Thanks for joining us. I'm so excited. This is our first episode of Ohio Rock Talks. I'm here today, I'm Alyssa Yapel, and I'm here today with my colleagues from the Ohio Division of Geological Survey. And they are really going to dig deep today into fossils and tell you all sorts of cool things about Ohio fossils. With me, I have Chuck Sammons, and he is the Publications and Outreach Supervisor. And so Chuck's going to help me with questions. Teams Live doesn't enable you to speak to us directly, but you can ask us questions through the Q&A. So please utilize your Q&A. We want to hear from you. If you just want to say hi, that's cool too. Let us know you're here, where you're from. We'd love to hear from you. And I also have with me Mark Peter, who's our paleontologist, and I have Chris Wade. And so they get to work with fossils every day, which is super cool. Mark's going to tell us about fossils and preservation, and then he's going to pass it over to Chris, who's going to tell us how he uses microfossils in his job. So I'm going to send this over to Mark now, and we'll get started.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Mark Peter, and I'm a paleontologist for the Division of Geological Survey. So for those of you who may not know, a paleontologist is a scientist who studies fossils in ancient life. And I'll be talking about what a fossil is and how they're preserved in Ohio. And after Chris's presentation, hopefully I'll have time to show you some of the kinds of fossils you can find around the state. So I work for the Geological Survey, and the Geological Survey is a division of the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. So we study and we map Ohio's geology. We keep geologic records like samples and drill cores where we drill deep into the subsurface. We collect groundwater data and model groundwater flow. We study the earthquakes in Ohio, and we have our own seismic network. We also study Ohio's energy resources, and Chris may talk a little bit about that. And then we have a publications department. So we actually try to educate the public, and we publish information about Ohio's mineral and fossil and rock resources. So I am very lucky. I have a great job. I get to play with fossils all the time. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. And when I was a kid, I was really into dinosaurs. And I had a whole collection of these guys. But in the 5th grade, a local teacher introduced me to the local fossils. And when I found out that I could find fossils in my backyard, in the creek behind our house, I became much more interested in those kind of fossils. And I'll talk about why we don't actually have any dinosaurs in Ohio. But what we do have are lots of invertebrate fossils. We have, and some of them are large and impressive, like this trilobite, Isotylus, which is our state fossil. And I really wanted to find a trilobite when I first started collecting fossils at age 11. So that's a little bit about me. So let's talk about what a fossil is. So a fossil is any evidence of a once living organism that's preserved in the rock record, right? So it had to be alive at one time, and it has to be preserved in rock. So here's an example of one of the more common fossils in Ohio. This is a brachiopod, and it has 2 shells, kind of like a clam, but inside was very different from a clam. This is one of the most common fossils that you'll find in Ohio. So let's talk a little bit about the different kinds of fossils and what fossils are not. One thing that a lot of people confuse with fossils are artifacts. So artifacts are actually things made by human beings. Could be tools or cultural items. It could be something like this arrowhead. I found this actually while I was fossil hunting, and it was the best thing I found that day, but it's not a fossil. This is an artifact. And the scientists who study artifacts are called archaeologists. And there are archaeologists at the universities and at the Ohio History Connection. And occasionally their work overlaps with the work of a paleontologist. So for example, if they find a fossil mastodon or mammoth that has been butchered by humans, the paleontologist may be interested in, say, what the mammoth was eating, and they may be able to find clues nearby that will tell them things like that. But the archaeologist may be more interested in how the humans were using the mammoth or mastodon. So slightly different terms in science. So there are different kinds of fossils too. So there are body fossils, which is just what it sounds like. These are part of an animal's body, and it could be a shell or like a tooth. It could be any part of the animal, or like this trilobite here. Trilobites were related to insects and crabs and lobsters and roly-polies. And these guys, generally the fossil you find is their hard shell on their back. But there's another kind of fossil besides a body fossil that we call a trace fossil. And trace fossils are evidence of behavior. So I have here a good trace fossil. This one is called chondrites, and you see it's a network of little burrows, and this is thought to be a feeding trace from a worm-like animal that was burrowing in the sediment. So there's actually a specialty of paleontologists who study trace fossils. So we also sometimes distinguish between macrofossils and microfossils. So a macrofossil is one that is big enough to see that you don't really need any magnification to see it. Something like this you can see with the naked eye. But if you have little itsy bitsy tiny fossils that are best studied under a microscope, those are called microfossils. And Chris may touch on how he uses microfossils as part of his work. So how are fossils preserved in Ohio? There's a number of ways. The most common way is basically unaltered remains. So I have here a giant fossil scallop. This one is actually from the Jamestown, Virginia area. And this was actually the first fossil described from North America. And it was just after the Jamestown colony was established. This one is called Chesopecten jeffersoni, and it's actually named Jeffersoni, excuse me. It's named for Thomas Jefferson, who wasn't alive at the time. So the species name actually came later, but this was the first fossil described in North America. But what I wanted to show you about it is that this is basically just the original shell of the fossil. Now it's undergone some changes from when it was alive. So here is another scallop. This is one I picked up on a beach in Florida, and you may be able to see that there's some like pink color to it. So this scallop still has some of its original color. Color is something that you lose pretty quickly. Within a few million years, generally most of the color is going to be gone. Also, a lot of shells have an organic covering on the outside. Like this shell, you can see around the edges, there's this kind of black stuff, and I can actually like flake that off. And so this is called the periostracum. It's organic, and soft parts in organic matter will decompose pretty rapidly. So there's bacteria and other organisms that will decompose soft parts. And so what you tend to end up with are just the hard parts of things. So typical fossils that you find are things like shells or teeth. This one is a megalodon shark tooth that I found while scuba diving near Charleston in the Cooper River. Or bones. So this is another one that I found while scuba diving. And sometimes those actually can become what we call permineralized or filled with minerals. So this is the way a lot of dinosaur bone is preserved. So this is a piece of dinosaur bone from out west. And you can actually polish it now. And it's hard. If I tap it, it feels like stone. And that's because minerals have filled all the little spaces in the bone. So here's a bone that I actually found in the woods just the other day. Oops, I'll get it in the camera there. And if you see on the end of it, you may be able to see that there's a whole bunch of little holes. And this is very lightweight. I mean, it feels like featherweight. And it's because when the animal dies, the organic tissue and the water and fluids that were in the bone, they come out and dry up. And then sometimes they become filled with minerals. And the same thing can happen with plant tissue. So here is, this is petrified wood, which we do find in Ohio. And we find this mostly in southeastern Ohio. And it feels just like regular wood on the outside. But if you look at the end of it, you can see it's really smooth. It actually takes a polish. And this is really heavy. This is much heavier than regular wood. It actually feels like rock. So this is petrified wood. And we call that permineralization, when the minerals fill up the pore spaces in the bone or the wood. Another way we find fossils preserved, and this is also typical of eastern Ohio, is we may find them as a carbon film. So this is a fossil fern that we find in our Pennsylvanian age rocks. Those are the same rocks that produce the coal that we mine. And it's basically a flattened carbon film. So the original organic molecules that made up this plant, they break down, and sometimes they break down all the way into elemental carbon. And so all we have is just an impression of where the leaf in this case was. So we call this carbonization. And a lot of your fossil plants in Ohio are preserved in this way. So sometimes we don't find the original shell. Let's say that the original shell has dissolved. And that's actually the case with this trilobite. And what we have here is basically the sediment that it was living in preserved the underside of the shell, and it shows the shape of it, but the original shell is actually missing. To show you some younger fossils, these are only a few million years old. This is a snail called Turritella. I call that young because in the fossils we find in Ohio are hundreds of millions of years old mostly. So this one is only, practically yesterday. So this is a snail shell called Turritella, and it's got the original shell preserved, although again, it may have been more colorful when it was alive. But if you look in the opening here, you may actually be able to see that there's some sediment inside there. Some sand and silt got in there and it actually filled the inside of the shell. Well, sometimes the shell gets dissolved away by like acidic groundwater or something. And what you have is a internal mold. So this is basically that sediment that filled the inside of the shell. The shell is gone, but we have this internal mold of the shell. So that's another way that we sometimes find fossils in Ohio.
Hey, Mark, and can I ask a question that
Sure.
Somebody wrote in with? So somebody on the topic of finding where you find fossils, they asked, when scuba diving, where are the fossils usually found? Are they on the seafloor or amongst rocks? So can you answer that?
Yeah, so the fossils are actually eroding out of rocks. So when I was scuba diving for fossils, it was in a river, and the river was excavating fossils that were Pliocene in age. So they were a few million years old, and they were in a relatively soft rock. And so the action of the water in the river would actually erode the fossils out, and then they would tend to accumulate on little cobble bars, we call them. They're basically larger rocks that kind of get stuck together, and they form little banks of gravel. And so what we would do is we'd drop down and try to find one of those gravel bars on the bottom. And the fossils were either on those gravel bars or in the sand near those gravel bars.
Cool, thanks. Sorry to interrupt. I just thought it was a good time to ask.
No, absolutely. So we were talking about molds and casts, and I wanted to just demonstrate an activity that you could do at home. So sometimes paleontologists like to make molds of fossils because sometimes the molds are easier to study than the fossil itself. And also, a lot of the replicas of fossils that you see in museums, we like to actually make casts from those molds and display a cast of the fossil rather than the original fossil. So I'll talk about this one maybe a little bit later or next week, but this is the jaw of a large armored fish, the one that is behind me, called Dunkleosteus. And this is not the original bone, but this is a cast that was made from the original bone. So how do you make a mold and a cast? Well, I have this trilobite. This is one I actually collected from a quarry near Dayton, Ohio. And so I thought this would be a good one to make a mold and some cast from. So I went to Joann's Fabrics and I bought some silicone mold making material. And this actually comes in two parts. You have a white part and a purple part. And you just squish the two parts together and you make a ball and you kind of knead it for a while. You have to work fast. You only have like 3 minutes to do it. And then you get this pliable kind of rubbery silicone material. And then what you do is you put it over your fossil, right? So you actually like smush it over the part that you want to take a mold from. And then you set it out and you let it dry overnight. And then what you can do is, if you want to make some copies of the fossil, you get some plaster of Paris. There it is, plaster of Paris. And you can buy this at hobby stores. Young children should probably use with parental supervision. But basically, you get like a little Dixie cup, and I put some warm water in there. I filled it about 1/3 full of warm water. And then what you do is you take the plaster. Let's get it so you can see it. So this is a spoonful of plaster. It kind of looks like flour. It's actually made from the mineral gypsum, which is a calcium sulfate with some water in it. And this is actually mined in Ohio, but not necessarily for plaster of Paris. But anyway, you pour that, you add it to your water. And now I'm making a mess. I'm spilling it all over the chair and everything. So you want to have a drop cloth or something. But I'm stirring it up using a little popsicle stick. And basically what you do is you just keep adding this and stirring it until it's about the consistency of kind of soupy toothpaste. And Alyssa knows how to do this because she and I actually worked together to make a whole bunch of these. So you get it all nice and soupy, a little bit more. And then when you get it the right consistency, I'm going to speed this up a little bit. Then what you do is you take your mold and you're going to very carefully, you're going to pour your plaster into the mold. And you see it's still kind of runny right now. And I'm going to just, you tap the bubbles out and then you just kind of let it sit for a while. And this may take about an hour before it actually hardens. So I don't want to wait an hour. So I have another one of a mold of the same trilobite. And this one is already hardened. So I'm going to just carefully pull it out of the mold. And you'll see that I have a copy of the original trilobite. So I'll put these together so you can compare them. So here's my original fossil right here. And here is a copy of it made out of plaster. And you can paint this so that it actually looks very similar to the original. So that's kind of an activity that you can do at home if you want.
And hey, Mark, I'll post some pictures for everyone to see to the Facebook event or to the Facebook page. So if you want to see some pictures, step by step of how we did it before, they'll be available there.
Okay, that's great. Well, I think this might be a good time to switch over to my colleague Chris, so he can tell you a little bit about how he uses fossils to date and match up rocks of the same age.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Chris Wade, and I work in the Energy Resources Group at the Geological Survey. Okay, and much of my work involves using what's called biostratigraphy, which is a closely related field of paleontology, and I use this to work on projects. Hey,
Chris, sorry, do you have a PowerPoint?
Yeah, I haven't started. I don't know.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything. Sorry, Go ahead.
Yep. So I use a lot of my stratigraphic expertise to work on projects that are beneficial to Ohio's oil and gas industry. So first I'll start off by giving a brief description about what stratigraphy and biostratigraphy are. So stratigraphy is just the study of layered rocks. And these are the type of rocks that you could see all throughout Ohio and the Midwest in general. And rocks that are layered record Earth's history. And a stratigrapher's job is to figure out how old those rock layers are. So that we can understand what the Earth was like at different points in times in the Earth's past. The study of stratigraphy goes all the way back to the late 1600s, when a Catholic bishop named Nicholas Steno made the observation that younger rocks appear on top of older rocks. So it's a pretty simple observation, but it gets pretty complicated when you try to look at that fact across the entire world. And more specifically, I have expertise in biostratigraphy, which involves using fossils to help figure out the age of those rock layers. So now I will share my PowerPoint, and I'm going to go through, give a bit of an explanation about biostratigraphy and show you how it works. So let me change to a laser pointer. Okay. So fossils are particularly important for studying Earth history because geological time is based mainly on fossils. So up on the screen, I have a geological time scale showing the three most recent geological eras, the Cenozoic, Mesozoic, and Paleozoic. And these eras are split up into different periods, and these periods are even split up into smaller units of time as well. And even the name of these three different eras directly relates to the fossils that you see in the rock record. As far back as the 1700s, geologists realized that you see these three distinct groupings of different types of fossils that you found together in the rock record. So the oldest rocks that we see a lot of fossils in are called Paleozoic, and this means ancient life. These are the sorts of fossils that you can see throughout Ohio. Like Mark mentioned, you could see brachiopods and echinoderms, crinoids like this, trilobites, and fish. And when you're looking at the older Paleozoic rocks, you can only find, for the most part, marine organisms and marine fossils. This is because life on land hadn't really expanded all that much yet and hadn't evolved yet.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah.
We have a question. Somebody asked, how can you tell how old the fossil is?
So if you mean where, like in which one of these periods it shows up in, it's because you use biostratigraphy, which I'll go through, to basically put the rocks in this stratigraphic order, is what we call it. And if you're asking about how do we get these numbers associated with it, basically we use the fossils to create like these different periods, like the Devonian or the Silurian. And then occasionally in different parts of the Earth, we have rocks that have minerals that we can actually date using like uranium-lead dating or argon-argon dating. There's some techniques that you could use to get an estimate of how long it's been since that mineral was created. And then basically what you do is you have those points in time where you have an actual number, and then you calculate what these boundaries would be based off of that. So say you have a date that's like 240 million years ago here, just above the Permian-Triassic boundary. Another one that's like 260 down here. You can kind of estimate what's in between. So I hope that answered that. And then moving up to the next higher geological era, it's called the Mesozoic, which means middle life. And this is when life started to look a little bit more like we're familiar with today. So a lot of the sea organisms, like clams, started really dominating benthic environments or sea bottom environments. And the dinosaurs, which are probably the most familiar of the Mesozoic fossils. And that's why it's sometimes called the age of the dinosaurs. And then the most recent geological era is called the Cenozoic, and this means new life. And the Cenozoic is when mammals like us, or like a mastodon or woolly mammoth here, began to take over after the dinosaurs went extinct. And birds also became really prevalent after the extinction of the dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous period. So these are just three very broad looks at how fossils can be used to split up the rock record. And we could also zoom in closer to individual fossil groups to get more precise, precise looks at the rock record. And using fossils to figure out the age of rock is called biostratigraphy. And biostratigraphy requires fossils that are called index fossils, which are really useful for determining the age of rocks. So fossils useful for determining rock age are called index fossils. And I'm going to go through and list a few characteristics that show what makes a good index fossil. So there are four main characteristics. They need to be geographically widespread, abundant, have a fast rate of evolution, and preserve easily. So it's important that they be geologically widespread because you need to be able to look at rocks from different parts of the world, could be on another continent completely, and figure out if it's the same age as rocks that you want to compare it to in another continent. So for example, here's a map of the current world. And if there was a species of animal that really liked living in the Mediterranean Sea right here and didn't live anywhere else, that wouldn't be a particularly good index fossil because you wouldn't be able to compare ages of the rocks from the Mediterranean to another area like the Gulf of Mexico using that fossil. So you want something that has a global spread. They also need to be abundant, and abundant organisms are usually small. And to illustrate this, I have sort of a food energy pyramid of marine environments. So at the base of the food pyramid, you have organisms that take the energy from the light of the sun and use that to live. And these are usually really abundant and small, and there are a lot of them. And as you go up a level to zooplankton, which eat the phytoplankton, the animals get a little bigger, and there are a little bit fewer of them. And that same pattern keeps happening as you go up to bigger and bigger organisms. So like you wouldn't want to use something like a big fish as an index fossil because, well, there aren't that many of them compared to smaller organisms down here at the bottom of the food energy pyramid. And they need to be abundant because it increases the chances that you'd find them if you're looking in the rock record. They also need to have a fast rate of evolution because we use the first appearances of rocks of fossils in the rock record to determine how old the rocks are. And if an organism has a faster rate of evolution, you'll get more new species in the rock record for a given amount of time. And just as an example here, I have a diagram that shows time vertically right here, and a species with a short life cycle on the left, and a species with a long life cycle on the right. So a species with a short life cycle just means that they don't live that long, so there isn't that much time between when they're born, reproduce, and die. So in a given amount of time, a species with a short life cycle can have, say, 5 generations like this. So this is kind of like a family tree, with each of these being a new generation. And because evolution happens when offspring are created and they might have mutations, you really need a lot of generations in a short amount of time to sort of speed up at the rate at which evolution occurs. If you compare this to a species with a long life cycle, in this same amount of time, they might only have 2 generations. So there's a lot less of a chance of evolution happening in that. And usually smaller organisms have shorter lifespans, so they tend to have faster rates of evolution.
Hey, Chris, we have a question. I don't know if you or Mark might know the answer, but somebody asked, what is the smallest fossil? And I guess we'll maybe clarify to what's the smallest fossil in Ohio?
So there are these organisms called acrotarchs, which are basically small organic, probably egg sacs of some sort of marine organism that can just be fractions of a millimeter, like hundredths of a millimeter big. So they're small enough that you can't see them with the naked eye, and you need a microscope to see them.
Thank you.
Yep. And the last characteristic of a fossil that makes a good index fossil is that they need to be able to be preserved easily. So I just have a couple examples up here on the screen. So on the left, there's a jellyfish, and on the right, brachiopods. And jellyfish are completely soft. They don't have any hard parts they don't have hard skeletons or anything. So if you can imagine, once a jellyfish dies and gets covered by sediment, it'll basically completely be destroyed, and it's very difficult to find a jellyfish in the rock record. So that would not make a good index fossil. But brachiopods, with their hard shells, end up being preserved a lot more easily. So they'd be a good species, or a good group of organism to use for an index fossil. And note that two of the characteristics for good index fossils, fast rate of evolution and abundance, are usually characteristics that small organisms have. So this kind of ties in with the question about the smallest fossil that we see in Ohio. So I study marine microfossils for biostratigraphy. And microfossils are great because they hit all of the main characteristics for good index fossils. So I have three different groups here up on screen. So on the left are conodonts, which are what I specialize in. And these are basically just the teeth from an extinct eel-like organism. So you can see a reconstruction of the organism here. And the interesting thing about conodonts is the animal itself, or most of the animal, didn't have any hard parts. So it didn't have hard skeletons or didn't have skeletal material. The only part of the animal that was hard were its teeth. So that's the only thing we usually find in the rock record. And to get an idea of how small these conodonts, the teeth, are pictured on the head of a pin. So they're really tiny. And a couple other groups that are useful for biostratigraphy are forams, and there are a couple pictures of foram shells here. And these are single-celled organisms like amoebas that you might have learned about in science class. But unlike amoebas, they create a little shell, and that shell is hard enough to be preserved in the rock record. And then in more modern times, so looking at more modern geological sediments and rocks, calcareous nanoplankton. So these are actual plankton that get their energy from the sun. They create a little calcite shell, and that ends up being preserved in limestones a lot. An interesting thing about this kind of nanoplankton is if you ever use chalk in school, it's usually made up of millions and millions of these calcareous nanoplankton. So chalk gets deposited when you have big blooms of these algae, and then they die and settle down and give us chalk to use, which is kind of interesting. I'm going to finish up by just kind of going through how I would actually go about doing a biostratigraphy project. So this is something I could do as a stratigrapher at the Ohio Geological Survey. So the first step, you need to go out into the field and collect rock samples to get the fossils out of. So this is a picture of an outcrop from southwestern Ohio at John Bryan State Park. It's a really cool place. Lots of really nice rock exposed there. So you'd go out there and collect samples for fossil analysis. And each of these arrows would represent like where I'd collect for fossils. And then the next step would be to draw a rock column. And this is basically just a drawing that represents the rocks that you see. It just makes it easier to organize the data and to publish it. And then once you get all your rock samples back to the lab, you check them for fossils. So in this example, I just have 4 different species listed, just species A, species B, species C, species D. And you list them where they show up in your samples. And so you can see that some of the species overlap and some of them don't. And you just kind of have this distinct appearance of new species in the rock record.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah.
Somebody asked, how do you get the microfossils out of the rock?
Yeah, so it depends on the microfossils you're looking at. So with conodonts, they are resistant to acid. And a lot of times you can find conodonts in limestone. And limestone, if you've ever, dropped acid on it or something, it fizzes, it dissolves in acid. So what you can do is stick the limestone in acid, the limestone will dissolve away, and it'll leave behind conodonts and other things that don't dissolve in acid. And then you use a microscope to look through and then physically pick out the conodont specimens. So once you have your species ranges, then you can start to make what are called biozones. So zone A would be where you just find species A in the rock record and nothing else. And you could have a zone called zone A plus B, where you have species A and species B overlapping. Zone B would be where you just have species B, and then so on throughout the rest of the samples you're looking at. And the next step would be to compare the fossils you found in your first section to rocks from other places. And I have a sort of fake section drawn up here. So you can see that you have zone A plus B in both places. So you could draw a line connecting them. You have zone B in both places, so you could connect those. And then you have zone C in both places too, and you can connect those. But over in this new second section, you could see that you have species C and species D overlapping, and you don't see that in the first section. So what that means is that this part of the rock record that's present here gets cut out in your first section. And then you have zone D in both rock sections too. And then in the second one, you have you have a higher species too, which I call zone E. And the next step would be to combine zones from each section. So in the first section, it starts lower, so you have more of the rock record down here than the second section. But then once you get above zone B, you have more of the rock record complete in the second section. So when you combine the two, this gives you an idea of what sort of species were present during a given time in the Earth's past. And you just keep doing this over and over again from more and more rock sections to get a complete idea of what sort of biozones or what species were present during the time that you're interested in studying. And doing this process is really important for reconstructing Earth history, because we need the fossils in different parts of the world to be able to determine whether rocks were deposited at the same time or not. And once we have sort of the order of fossils worked out, we can start to reconstruct what sort of environments were where and when they occurred. So I have these two paleogeographic maps here to give you an idea of how we reconstruct Earth history. So this one's from the early Mississippian, which is from about 345 million years ago. And the other one is from the late Mississippian, which is from about 325 million years ago. So what we can do is look at the fossils and then figure out what sort of rocks were present, whether they're marine or terrestrial or land rocks, and figure out the distribution of different rock types. Then we could go higher up in the rock record and do the same thing and use the fossils to determine whether there was land present or water present. And doing things like this is really important for looking for natural resources, particularly oil and gas, because oil and gas are created in very specific types of environments. So we need to be able to basically make maps to better understand where oil and gas will occur and make more economical decisions when we're looking for it. So that's kind of what I use fossils for in my job. I'm going to hand it back over to Mark, who's going to basically give you a preview of some of the things that we'll be covering in the next few webinars.
Hi, hi everybody. So I am going to just give you a preview, like Chris said, of what we're going to be covering in the next 3 webinars. So we're going to basically be going through the different geologic time periods that Chris was talking about that occur in Ohio. And we're going to tell you a little bit about the environments and what kind of fossils you would expect to find there. And then in our final webinar, we'll actually talk about how to go fossil collecting in Ohio. And so I'll give you some collector tips in that one. So we start back in the Paleozoic era during the Ordovician period. So I don't know if you can read the Ordovician right here. Hold it a little bit higher. And those are the oldest rocks that we have in Ohio. And they actually occur down here near Cincinnati in the southwestern part of the state. And typical Ordovician fossils will be in shale or limestone. And I've got here a piece of limestone from down near Cincinnati. This is something you might find if you go fossil hunting at Cedar Creek State Park, which you can do with a permit that you get at the Corps of Engineers Visitor Center. We'll talk more about that later. But this is basically a fossil seafloor from the Ordovician. And you see there's all kinds of little seashells here. And so if you're finding lots of, seashells, the paleontologist will ask oneself, what kind of environment, was this? And we actually can compare these kind of fossils that we find here. So we're finding seashell fossils, and these are brachiopods, which we and there's some other fossils in here which are only found in salt water. So we actually know that this was not only a time when we had water covering Ohio, but it was salt water. So we can actually learn a lot about what the ancient environment was like by studying rocks like this. So this one's full of fossil brachiopods and bryozoans and other bits of broken up fossils.
Hey, Mark. I have a couple of questions that I think you might be able to answer as you're going through these. So I'm just going to ask, we had one question that someone asked, what type of fossils are found in Athens/Wayne National Forest? And then somebody had asked, I have a fossil, how would I be able to tell how old it is? So I thought maybe those might be able to be answered as you're going through these different time periods.
Right. So down near, yeah, I'll keep that in mind. Because we won't get to Athens just yet. But the short answer is that you can use a map like this. This is called a geologic map. And this is a geologic map of Ohio. And you see there's the different colors on here. And each color represents a different time period and where it's exposed in the state at the surface. So to take the pink one, the Ordovician that we were just talking about, those rocks of Ordovician age are exposed near southwestern Ohio. So if you're in one of the counties in the pink area and you go and look in the creek behind your house, you're going to expect to find those marine fossils like brachiopods and things. And if you live in Athens, which is, down here in the light blue zone, you're going to find much younger rocks of Pennsylvanian age, and you're going to expect to find things like fossil plants or petrified wood. So, yeah. And what was the second question, Alyssa?
I have a fossil. How would I be able to tell how old it is?
Okay. So that you can, one clue is where you found it. And another clue is actually you will need to identify the fossil. And we'll talk more about that in in our last webinar. But you can use a resource that is published by the Division of Geological Survey called Fossils of Ohio. And this book is full of pictures of fossils, and you can read about them and try to identify the different kinds. These are some of the conodont microfossils that Chris likes to work with. So you would need to identify your fossil, and then we can put it on a geologic time scale, and we can figure out how old it is using methods that Chris just described. So our Ordovician rocks, we have things like brachiopods, which I mentioned before, and we have things like trilobites, which this is a trilobite that I found. I actually found this one in Indiana, just across the border from Ohio. So this guy's not actually from Ohio, but the trilobites, which were, again, arthropods related to horseshoe crabs and insects and lobsters. And they actually lived a lot like a modern horseshoe crab. So this is a modern horseshoe crab. These guys, limulus, are still alive today. You might find them on a Florida beach or on the East Coast. And they have a hard shell on their back, but underneath they had legs and antennae and things that typically are not preserved in Ohio, but rarely they can be. And then we have this trilobite. This is actually our state fossil. This is a trilobite called Isotelus. And this is a small one. This is the size you might find if you go to Cedar Creek State Park to go fossil collecting. But these guys actually grew. They molt their shells and they grow each time they did. And they can actually get big like this one. So this is a cast of one that was found at the Huffman Dam near Dayton. And this is the fossil that they actually based our state fossil on. It's the state invertebrate fossil. It's called Isotelus, and it is a large trilobite. So these guys were crawling around on the seafloor. I wonder if you could like take a crab cracker and crack the legs and eat it. I'm allergic to shrimp, crab, and lobster, but I wonder if I'd be allergic to Isotelus. I don't know. So let's move on to the next time period. So the Silurian is a little bit younger. So the ones we were just talking about were around 450 million years old. So, you know, these are more like 420 or so million years old. And again, you've still got a sea environment, and you can see the Silurian rocks are distributed in western Ohio. And this trilobite that I showed you earlier when I was talking about molds and casts, this one is a typical Silurian trilobite called Gravicalamine. And again, the shell is not preserved. This is very typical for the dolostone rocks that you frequently find in the Silurian. So here's another Silurian rock, similar preservation. The shell is dissolved, but you can see an internal mold of these large brachiopods called pentamerous. And one of my favorite Silurian fossils is this big. This is a bivalve, like a clam. Again, the original shell is gone, but we have the internal mold of it. And farmers used to call these beef hearts. because they actually they're about the size and shape of a cow's heart. So it's always interesting to see what farmers call things. Let's see. Oh, yes. Here's another fossil that you find in a lot of the older rocks in Ohio. This is called a horn coral. And they're called horn corals because, again, the farmers thought, oh, this kind of looks like a cow's horn. But it has nothing to do with cows or even horns, really. This is just the solitary shell of a coral, which would have been like a little anemone-like animal that lived in here with stinging tentacles. Again, this is an animal that lived in the ocean. In this case, a shallow sea. So moving on to the Devonian period. So here we're getting up, you know, from about like 360 to 400 million years old. And again, we still have marine environments. And the band of Devonian rocks, actually, there's a band that goes right up central Ohio, and then there's a little bit in western Ohio, and then a little bit along Lake Erie up here. In the Devonian period, we have our similar invertebrate kind of animals, but one big change from the Devonian is we start to see a lot more fossil fish. And let's see. So this is a Devonian rock, and I don't know if you can see the kind of bumpy structure on here, but this is a placoderm, and this is a armored fish. And another armored fish that we mentioned before is the big guy behind me, Dunkleosteus. And that guy got to be about 30 feet long. And so there were some monster fish in the Devonian period. Here's a little model that I found, same place I found my fossil dinosaur model. This is Dunkleosteus, and we've got a lot of those in the Devonian Ohio shale. And this one was actually found in a road construction project up near Cleveland. So moving along, because we are short on time, to the Mississippian. So the Mississippian is actually the lower Carboniferous period, but in North America, we call it the Mississippian because rocks of this age are exposed in the state of Mississippi. And you'll notice this depicts a marine environment, and it's full of these animals called crinoids. And crinoids are actually what I study. And crinoids are kind of like a starfish on a stick. So if you imagine a starfish and the mouth is on the bottom, and you flip it upside down so the mouth is on the top, and you put a stem on it, you have a crinoid. And so here's the arms of a fossil crinoid, and it would have had a stem coming down. And in the Mississippian rocks, you'll find things like this that are like stacked Cheerios. You can see there's a hole, so you can see in this end, there's a hole in the end, and it looks like a stack of Checkers or Cheerios. And these are stems of crinoids, and these are very common in your Mississippian rocks. In your Pennsylvanian rocks, which are younger still, so again, this is the upper Carboniferous. Here you find a mix of marine environments, but also a lot of lowland, swampy land environments. And you see this is a dense swamp. And so you're going to find a lot of plant fossils, like these fern fossils here. And these fossils are actually vegetation that was decaying in the swamps that eventually produced the coal that we find in eastern Ohio. And we'll talk more about that in a few weeks. Finally, well, almost finally, the last of the Paleozoic eras in Ohio was the Permian. and we only have the early Permian in Ohio up to about 290 million years ago. We had mostly land environments. So you'll find freshwater lakes and streams and kind of swampy areas, but you're not finding those marine fossils anymore by the Permian. But what we do find are some things that actually look like dinosaurs. They're not dinosaurs. Dinosaurs wouldn't evolve for another 50 million years, but we get things like Dimetrodon, which was a mammal-like reptile. So, and these guys were pretty big. I mean, some of these guys could be 8-10 feet long, and these were living in Ohio during the Permian period, about 290 million years ago. So then we have a big gap in the rock record. So for almost 300 million years, Ohio was above sea level. And when land is above sea level, you tend to get more erosion than deposition of rocks. And so when the dinosaurs should have been walking around, and there may have been some walking around in Ohio, if any rocks were deposited, they were completely eroded away. So we have no record of dinosaurs from Ohio, unfortunately. But we do have some very recent fossils. And by very recent, I mean anywhere from, say, 12,000 to over 1 million years old. We have record of the Pleistocene. And where's my Pleistocene? There they are. So during the Pleistocene, we have things like woolly mammoths and American mastodons, and we find fossils like this is a mastodon tooth, and this is a mammoth tooth, and we find these kind of fossils in patchy deposits around Ohio, and these are from the last ice ages that were in Ohio, and we'll have a whole webinar devoted to those ice age fossils. So that's all I have, Melissa or Alyssa.
Okay, I know we're about out of time, but I did have 2 questions that people asked. So Chris or Mark, I don't know which one of you want to answer these. Maybe we can try and make them, just quick answers. But if you found a new fossil in Ohio, do you know how would we name it? Are you aware of how that's done?
Yeah, I actually got to name a new species of crinoid. And so it was a genus that already existed, but it was a new species. So the person who describes it, the scientist who describes it, actually gets to name it. And there are rules for naming things, but you have a lot of freedom to pick a name that you want. So mine was the first specimen from this genus that was found in North America. So I named it Temnocrinus americanus. Not very original name, but it was a name that made sense. Now, sometimes fossils are named after people. So for example, Dunkleosteus, the big guy behind me, the species of this particular one is Dunkleosteus terrelli, and it was named for a collector whose last name was Terrell, and he actually found some of the first specimens of it up on the shores of Lake Erie. So sometimes we honor the people who find them by naming the fossil after them.
Cool. And then last question, and I'll ask Mark and Chris, both of you, maybe to just touch on this. Somebody had asked, how do you get to work with fossils? So Mark, can you just go over what schooling did you go through? And then I'll pass it to Chris, and I think we're going to be out of time and end it there.
Well, the short answer is that most paleontologists who work in universities or for geological surveys have either a master's degree or a PhD in their specialty area. So there's a lot of schooling involved. I'm actually still working on my PhD at Ohio State University, but there is a lot of schooling involved, and I recommend that you learn fundamentals like math and be able to write well, because those skills will serve you well if you want to be a paleontologist. Maybe Chris has some other thoughts.
Yeah, so like you said, it involves a lot of schooling. So I have a master's degree, and I recently started working on my PhD part-time at Ohio State as well. But to just get some experience around fossils, there might be some museums that you could volunteer at. So that'd probably be the place to go. Or if you're in college or thinking about heading to college, you could just ask a geology professor if they have any projects that they need some help with. That's a good way to get some hands-on experience with it.
Cool. Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Chuck. This was exciting. I hope everybody watching had a good time. We had some great questions, and I look forward to seeing y'all next week. Have a good one.
You too, Alyssa.